Welcome to This Week in Local, a Localogy podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Localogy analysts Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Charles Laughlin from Localogy, joined by my Localogy analyst colleague, Mike Boland. Mike, how you doing?
Hi, Charlie. Hi.
Great. So we're each going to talk about some sort of data-centric things we've written about in the last few days. Mike, you just wrote something about some interesting SMB business formation data from Yelp. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, good news from Yelp. And it came at a good time because, we're in the middle of, a suffering economy and a triple-demic and all this other stuff. So some good news from Yelp. It released what it's calling the 2022 New Business Openings Report. And it's reporting that into 2002, we saw a record number of SMBs open in the U.S., which in turn you could argue is sort of potentially a leading indicator for economic health on the horizon. We always talk about how the SMB sector is sort of the heartbeat of the U.S. economy. But that aside, what it specifically reported was that year over year, new business openings are up 12% in 2022 from 2019. Now, the reason they chose that year over year equation is to essentially eliminate the outliers that were the sort of COVID era years, which, aren't really telling of normal times. So that sort of apples to apples was interesting, but also it sort of signals that the health of the SMB landscape, at least measured by new business openings, is healthier than it was pre-pandemic, going by 2019 as sort of like a benchmark. So just diving into the numbers a little bit, on a quarterly basis, each period in 2022 exceeded 2019, the biggest delta being in Q3 with a 15% increase. As for verticals, that sort of aggregate growth was sort of buoyed by a few different categories, the leading of which was home services with 40%. There was a 40% delta from 19 to 22 in new business openings. What they're calling local services was 30%, hotels and travel at 28%, autos 25%, and then health and beauty at 17%. Geographically speaking, interestingly, the South saw the greatest percentage of growth in those new business openings, looking at states like Mississippi and Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and then also some of the geographies that over-indexed were densely populated U.S. states, California and Texas, which were sort of driven by the major metros in those areas like L.A. and Dallas. But beyond the data itself and the sort of good news that signals quantitatively, we took sort of a qualitative analysis route when writing about this, in that not only are these new businesses outnumbering those that we saw in 2019, but there might be some interesting qualitative differences. And this reminds me of an interview that I did with Yelp's Chad Richard a few months ago, and we're going to actually replicate this discussion on stage at L23 in April, is that the types of businesses that opened from 2020 through 2022 really had their work cut out for them, right? They had to always be on top of sort of a volatile set of variables like, mask mandates and local consensus on vaccines, and then other things that are sort of non-pandemic, but maybe related. We had, the Great Resignation. They had to be really good at recruiting. They're dealing with inflation. They're dealing with supply chain issues. And it just has forced them to be a lot savvier. So the sort of outcome of all of this is sort of interesting in that the question of, is this new batch of SMBs going to be inherently more sort of savvy and fire tested? And I think that there's that normal sort of turnover process that happens, but I think it's been a bit accelerated. You have some of those younger generations that are generation of proprietors that are inherently, digitally native and more savvy, but some of these other factors might have forced them to just like elevate their game a little bit more when it comes to digital marketing and operational excellence. So the result of all that is the question of, is this sort of Darwinian dynamic out there now where like the bar has been raised and the skills it takes to require or to compete, excuse me, in the SMB landscape, are they inherently a lot more advanced than maybe they were 5 years ago? So that's sort of the big question. But yeah, a lot of interesting things in the data.
Right. So this begs a number of questions, and I don't know if the data revealed answers to any of these. We can take a stab at them. Now, you mentioned sort of this notion of the bar has been raised in terms of the operational, lack of a better term, operational boxes do you have to check in terms of digital adoption and other things in order to survive. Do we have any sense of who's starting these businesses and how prepared are they to check those boxes? And we may not know that. Yeah.
That's a good question. We don't know. I think that there was a certain assumption I made in terms of there's a share of them that are going to be inherently younger in just that sort of, new forest regrowth sort of turnover analogy you see with, businesses and a lot of businesses that went out of business in the pandemic. It sort of accelerated their retirement. A lot of businesses said, well, I'm a few years from retirement anyway. It just sort of pushed that up. So I think that normal turnover of, an old business retires, that spot on Main Street gets replaced with a newer, potentially younger business. I mean, younger in both the age of the business and in the proprietor. That sort of turnover was accelerated. So I think in terms of profiling the personas of these business, to answer your question, we can make some assumptions that a certain share of them will be younger and more digitally savvy. But other sort of psychographics, I'm actually not sure what that makeup is. I bet it's pretty evenly spread.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're making an inference and making an assumption that sort of younger, more digitally native business is going to be more prepared to ride out the inevitable speed bumps that small businesses face.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think, it'll be interesting to test that assumption, inference, whatever we want to call it, going forward over the next few years, because it's going to be some tough times over the next, between inflation, supply chain, labor markets, all the things that you mentioned that are existing challenges for businesses. We'll see, we'll see what the churn rate is on those new business formations, I think, as we look ahead.
Yeah. And one of the points here is that because they're dealing with all of those challenges, they've been forced to develop new muscles. Like they've been spending the last 2 years running uphill, right? That develops new muscles because, and a byproduct of that is they've learned how to do things like, have a certain frequency or cadence where they're updating their profiles on places like Google and Yelp because they sort of have to. They have to update hours of operation and their current mask policies, things like that. Have just forced them to be more digitally savvy. But then the byproduct is they're going to be better digital marketers. And again, that leads to the question of, will that raise the bar overall in digital marketing? So anyone sort of entering this competitive landscape, any SMBs, they sort of have to be at a certain baseline of savvy to even survive. And it's that sort of question of like, is there a new sort of Darwinism in the new face of the American SMB?
And I think one thing, this sort of refers to things we've talked about in previous podcasts. One thing I would expect, and this will be interesting to explore over the next few months, is will the types of digital tools that will become sort of table stakes for running a small business change pretty rapidly over the next few months, given what we've been seeing happening with generative AI and other things.
Well, the tools themselves change.
Right.
That's a good question. I mean, it's the standard name, address, place stuff. It's listings, it's Yelp reviews, it's social, but like will that bundle start to include
a lot of content creation too, on social media and ads and so on. So that we'll see. I mean,
TikTok, you have to know the language of TikTok and how to make a compelling TikTok video to make it as an SMB.
And how will the tools for creating that video change? In the near term.
Exactly.
We'll see. I don't have answers, I have questions.
Yeah, yeah. So, Charlie, let's move on to your topic and some data that you're looking at. But first, we're going to pause for a quick commercial break. Hi, everyone. It's Mike Boland, Senior Analyst at Localogy, here to tell you about L23. It's our annual flagship event held this year in sunny San Diego, Coronado Bay to be exact. And it's all about charting the course of local commerce and tackling all of the factors and topics that continue to impact the business of local media, advertising, and commerce. So we've got a solid speaker lineup already, and we'd love to see you in Coronado Bay, April 17th through 19th, and you can find out more at localogy.com. Now back to our episode.
Okay, and we're back. Mike, so sort of going a little further on this sort of data angle we're taking for this conversation today. I wrote something this week about another local data powerhouse, Foursquare, issued some interesting data, and it kind of goes back to some of this post-pandemic stuff that we were at least touching on in your segment, which is your Foursquare released some data, and it was sort of a combination of sort of observed data, and survey data that even created some interesting contrast in terms of measuring what's really going on in this sort of back to the office versus remote work question. We've been seeing a lot of contradictory data about, though I think generally the data has been pointing to a new normal of hybrid work, et cetera, which those are all terms that make me cringe a little to say, but, they're sort of the language we're using now to describe this environment. And what was interesting, they were kind of sharing some survey data, and I think it was New York and Washington, forgive me if I'm a little off on that, where the locations were, but kind of looking at, what people were saying about what they're doing in terms of back to work in the office versus remote, and what the observable location data actually showed. And they had there's like a heat map that we embedded into the post showing sort of the churn during the day of people coming in and out of office locations in New York City. What the survey they cited said that 39% say they're going back to the office 5 times a week. And the observable data that they shared, which was captured in November, I believe, and it excluded the Thanksgiving week to sort of get rid of that sort of, everyone's taking time off. No one's going to the office during that week. They excluded that, and they showed that only about 3% were going back to the office as frequently as 5 times a week. So there's this big gap between what people are reporting and what the observable data is actually showing, which I thought was really interesting. And we could infer all kinds of things or take a lot of guesses as to why there seems to be this gap between reported behavior and actual behavior. Maybe there's some of this is, we know the bosses want us back into the office, but we're not really going back to the office. So we're just going to say that we are, but why, it's a survey. Why, who cares, right? I don't know if it's that or something else. But another thing that was interesting out of this was that I know one thing that we kind of read about a lot during and immediate, kind of peak pandemic period was people who had been working in an office now were working from home, moving from their expensive suburb or city location out to the sticks to get more space, to stretch their, get some elbow room, basically.
Milk some cows.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And what the Foursquare data showed was that that might have been something of a myth that only 11% or something like that had actually done this, when I was under the impression it was a much more common occurrence. So those are some interesting, and I think this kind of reinforces some of what we believe, which is that we're pretty much in a fully hybrid environment. But it also kind of pierced a few myths, one of which was that there'd been a lot more sort of leaving the city, leaving the close and expensive suburbs to go to cheaper places where you can get more space and have a nicer life in a lot of ways. And that doesn't seem to be the case at all. So I don't know, there's some contradictory things there, but I think it's just kind of interesting, all the different data that's coming out there about, are people really going back to the office to the degree that, Elon wants them to, and so on. So anyway, It was just kind of
Yeah.
some interesting stuff.
That actually doesn't surprise me too much, the 11%, because I think that we heard a lot about that.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing where, it's anecdotal. Reporters like to write headlines, and it's also sort of high profile moves, like, the CFO of the company
Right.
just moved to Utah to his ski lodge, right? I mean, it's a high profile anecdotal type of thing, but it's not representative of like the majority of people that are doing those types of moves.
Right. No, and I think, as I recall, covering this sort of through the pandemic, through the work from home, peak work from home era, you did read a lot about companies, for example, moving from California to Utah. There's a few
Yeah.
companies in our world that kind of did that. I don't want to blurt out a name of a company and get it wrong, but there were a few. And I think what shook out from a lot of that was that a lot of times the most senior people kind of lived that sort of, kind of exciting lifestyle choice that came out of the work from home movement, which was to move to a ski lodge or move or move to Florida from New York or to Hawaii or whatever, and do the whole work from home thing from an amazing place. And I think it turned out that was the CFO and the CEO and the C-suite more so than the assistant VP of marketing,
Yeah, exactly.
Which was kind of fun and interesting, and maybe not an inconvenient truth for the C-suite in some cases.
Yeah. And I think we're going to see a wide variance that comes down to a lot of factors when it comes to individual company policies, whether they're doing 4 days a week, whether they're doing in a lot of cases, my wife is an employment attorney. She's in charge of her company's back to work program. And it seems like what's happening a lot is that it's like team dependent. Like if your superior is the type of person, and it comes down to culture and persona, if people are like hands-on, you need to be in front of me type of people. So it's going to vary a lot based on the decision makers and their particular feelings on the productivity of remote work versus in the office, the type of work, obviously, whether it's collaborative, whether it's at home. I think that there's certainly a lot of, things that show up on the balance sheet or more often the P&L that sort of speak in favor of remote work. When you look at the largest item you typically see expense-wise on a P&L is, besides headcount, it's usually office rent, something along those lines. Sometimes that can be a sunk cost if you got the building anyway.
Or the lease, or you have a lease that's,
Yeah, that could be pushing some folks away from remote work if the CEO is really just wanting to get, even though it's a sunk cost, wanting to realize some ROI on that building lease. So I think there's like a million little sort of things that influence that decision, and it's going to be different at each company. But what makes that interesting is if it becomes some sort of like recruiting tool, if we get into the situation where it's a buyer's market or a seller's market, for talent, which we often see in highly technical fields, they're going to use that as leverage in terms of negotiating, or, I want to only come in 1 day a week or not at all.
Right.
So I think that it's going to continue to be like a new thing that's in the quiver of HR reps and recruiters in terms of, and that's going to, whether or not you're dealing with a buyer or a seller's market for talent, it's going to be used on both sides of that table. But I think it's going to be one of those things that's going to be a negotiating tactic for recruiting.
No, and there's no question about it. And I think there's some interesting tensions on a couple of points between what data is going to show and what the opinions of CEOs are. One of these is on sort of the value of the office. For example, Scott Galloway, someone you and I both, I think, follow pretty closely, makes the point, which I tend to agree with just instinctually, that if you're a young person in their 20s working up in the career, the office is a good place for you, because there's FaceTime, there's building relationships, there's all that stuff that I think at a certain point in your career is important. I will never go back to an office. I'm much older, and it doesn't make any sense for me. I mean, but it does for that, so it depends on life stage, career stage. There's a different answer.
Yeah.
So that's one. The other is the productivity results for office versus remote work or work from home. I think a lot of CEOs want to say, and I'm not going to name any names, I think we can think of one or two probably, want to say that remote workers are just goofing off at home and the remote workers. And actually, a lot of data that's been collected tends to support the remote works, and that may not be what the person who wants to shove everyone back into the office to get the ROI on that sunk cost wants to hear or wants to put out there,
Yeah, and it comes down to the individual workers too. Again, the theme here is it depends.
Yeah.
And I think that if you have folks that are self-starters, that are highly motivated, they can be productive under any environment. But if you have sort of people that sort of need to be led by their nose, and also you brought up a good point, sort of younger employees or early career individuals tend to need that direction and that mentorship. I think another point is like I've lived this whole arc because, you and I have been working remotely long before the pandemic in terms of sort of the companies we worked for have had sort of far-flung remote analyst teams. And I've been working remote since 2002. So I've lived that whole arc. At the very beginning of that, I was in my late 20s, and it was indeed very isolating because I was looking at all my friends who had like sort of a social graph at work, and they would go for after work drinks, and that sort of social aspect of work is certainly there, and it's a hunger when you are in your late 20s and early to mid 30s. Right now,
at my age, it's an annoyance.
Not have to do that. Right.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I think we'll probably going to see a lot more data coming out. And again, we've talked in the past about the sort of remote work ecosystem, software ecosystem that's emerging that we'll talk a lot about at our conference. We're going to have two great speakers on that topic. Anyway, Mike, I think that's a good point to end things on. Do you want to read us out?
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This has been This Week in Local. This episode was brought to you by L23, which is Localogy's flagship event taking place this year in San Diego, April 17th through 19th. And you can find out more at localogy.com. And stay tuned every week for more episodes of This Week in Local. You can find the show on all major podcast networks. Please subscribe, like, and comment. So I'm Mike Boland with Charles Laughlin. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Localogy's This Week in Local with Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.